Welcome to the Futurist Society podcast, where we delve into the latest advancements in technology, science, and culture. The Futurist Society is your window into all of the awesomeness that the future holds.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Futurist Society, where as always, we are talking in the present, but talking about the future. Thank you so much to everybody joining us. I have a really special guest today. André Bormanis is a writer and producer of some of my favorite intellectual properties that have really inspired me to bring you this podcast, as well as think about the future in an optimistic light. André, thank you so much for joining us. I mean, you've had experience with Star Trek, you've had experience with the Orville. Tell us how your career started and what got you into this.
Well, thanks, and it's a pleasure to be here, Imran. I've always been interested in space and astronomy from a very young age. I was born in Chicago, but I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, the 1960s and 70s, and I remember vividly a couple of experiences. One being a camping trip with the Boy Scouts when I was 11 years old, and going out to a place called Oak Creek Canyon, which at the time was it's near the town of Sedona, which has become a very popular tourist destination in recent years, and not so recent years. It's been that way for a while, but certainly back when I was a little kid, weren't a lot of people there, and so the skies were very dark, and you were up in the mountains, and I remember seeing the Milky Way for the first time. It was like a solid band of white light stretching across the sky from horizon to horizon. That's how dark the skies were back then. And I was flabbergasted. And then some months later, got to see Saturn through a telescope for the first time. And it literally took my breath away. I couldn't believe this tiny little disk with a tiny little ring around it, that you could see that with a telescope, by the way, with a telescope with about the aperture of that little one over there. and I was hooked. This was around the time of the Apollo moon landings, which was a very exciting period, of course, in history. And of course, I was a huge fan of Star Trek. I saw it when it was originally on the air a few times, but I was very young and I didn't really understand it. My older brother was a fan of the show. And then I really started to get to know the show, the original Star Trek series, when I was in high school. Because they were starting to show it in reruns after it had been canceled. And I'd come home from high school and, Star Trek was on TV pretty much every afternoon at 4 or 5 o'clock or whatever. And I watched it religiously, read a book about the making of Star Trek, which I found fascinating. I had no idea, at that time how TV shows were made. But I never imagined in my wildest dreams that I would be writing for Star Trek, for new incarnations of Star Trek, and then other science fiction shows. But I was a physics major in college, studied physics and astronomy, and did a year of graduate school in physics, and decided, I didn't really want to go that route. My primary interest was astronomy, which is, applied physics. But all of my friends who were going on to get their PhDs in astronomy spent all these years in graduate school, and they couldn't get jobs in the field. They ended up becoming computer programmers, because back then there was only about 1,500 professional astronomers in the United States. I don't know how many more there are today, probably not a lot more. And I kind of, I didn't really care for computer programming. And that was something that seemed like, if I'm going to do that, why am I not just, getting a computer science degree? And so I wandered a little bit. I'd always had an interest in writing, creative writing. I had a literature minor when I was in college, just because I liked to read books that didn't have a lot of equations in them. So, I took a lit class every semester. And I was a pretty good technical writer. And I had a physics professor who recognized that and encouraged me to pursue technical writing, because there aren't a lot of people who know science who can write reasonably well. And one thing led to another. I started to take some screenwriting classes for fun. Star Trek: The Next Generation had come on television. They had an open submission policy where you could send in scripts and they would read them. And a few people actually sold scripts that way and became writers. I took a shot at that in the late 1980s. I got a nice thanks, but no thanks. But I wasn't discouraged per se. And another long story short, I was offered a NASA fellowship to spend 2 years at a place called the Space Policy Institute at the George Washington University. And they looked at the policy and political dimensions of the space program, which was foundering at the time. And that's something that I found very interesting, because a lot of the work that I did when I was an undergraduate and in grad school was funded by NASA grants. And, I was just sort of shocked that so little had happened since the Apollo moon landings. The shuttle finally got off the ground, and that was impressive. But then when the Challenger exploded, I started to read all of these articles about how, political factors were such a huge part of what essentially compromised the design of the shuttle system. And it tried to be all things to all people, and it failed in its one primary goal, which is to make access to low Earth orbit inexpensive for both humans and payloads. Well, I thought, hey, I want to know more about that. And that the program at George Washington gave me that opportunity. But I still, was writing, and I was coming up with stories for Star Trek through a lot of knocking on doors and getting passed along from one person to another. I managed to find an agent in Hollywood who said she would try to help me get a meeting to pitch stories at Star Trek. And I'm like, great. Months went by, nothing was happening. And I just said, I'm going to call this person one more time. And if the answer is still nothing happening, I'll just kind of let it go. And she said, oh, no, they're not taking any pitches right now, but they're looking for a new science consultant. And I was like, well, what's that? And she said, well, they have somebody who looks at the scripts for the right science and technical language, and to make sure that the stories aren't too far out into fantasy. And the guy who's been doing it got promoted onto the writing staff. And so they're looking for somebody new, and they want somebody who knows the show, knows how to read a script, and knows science. I'm like, well, okay. So I had a conversation with one of the producers. She and I kind of hit it off over the phone. She invited me to come out and meet the writing staff. Again, I'm still living in Washington, D.C. at this time, and had to go to a conference in Tucson. And so while I was there, I drove out to L.A. I met Michael Piller and Ron Moore and Brandon Braga and Jerry Taylor and all of these fantastic people whose names I'd seen in the credits. And I'm like, I can't believe I'm here. And Michael Piller, who was the executive producer of Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, which was just starting at that time, gave me an audition script. He said, here's a script. It's got a lot of technical issues. I need your help. And the guy who'd been doing that job, Narain Shankar, who'd gotten a PhD in physics from Cornell and decided he didn't want to do that anymore and had come out to LA, he had an internship at Star Trek. And that's how he became involved in the show and became their science consultant. He convinced them that they needed somebody not full-time, but on a regular basis to handle this sort of thing. So he showed me the format that he used to write up his notes. I read the script. I went to the library. I did some research. I wrote up 7 or 8 pages of notes, faxed them to Michael Piller the next day, and then flew back to DC. And a couple of weeks later, Jerry Taylor called me and said, Michael loved your notes. The job's yours if you want it. Wow.
That's great.
And they literally needed me to start to the week that I finished my master's degree in science, technology, and public policy at GW. And my NASA fellowship ended. So May of 1993, I drove from DC out to LA.
Wow.
Figured I'll give this a shot for a couple of years. I was still young at the time. And I figured if I can't make it go as a writer, I can always go back to DC and continue the stuff that I was doing, with NASA and with some other think tanks and so forth. But it worked out. I eventually sold a couple of stories. They had me write a script. They liked that, had me do another one. And then I became a full-time writer and producer on Star Trek Enterprise for all 4 seasons. And I've just been doing TV ever since.
So I love the trajectory that you had, and honestly, I really like where it's kind of where it's at right now with the Orville, which is
Mhm.
something that
Yes.
I feel like is a great continuation of that. For so long, there was really, like, when you look at science fiction and imaginings of the future, very dystopian, right? Very negative,
Yes.
very pessimistic. And the Orville was kind of like this fun experience to get people back in, like, oh, hey, the future could be cool. I can't wait to live in that kind of environment. And I guess my question to you is, like, what do you think that the difference was? Where did this change in
Mhm.
pop culture that all of a sudden now we're looking at it um, negatively? And
Right.
when, in the 60s, everybody was just so excited about everything that the future could hold. I feel like that's
Hmm.
when the original Star Trek, even in when the Next Generation came out, there was
Yes.
tons of great science fiction from that time. But what do you think? I mean, you kind of lived it, right? You were you
Yeah.
were on the ground floor.
No, absolutely. And yeah, there has been there has certainly been dystopian science fiction for many, many decades.
Yeah.
And if you look back at Brave New World or Fahrenheit 451, Ray Bradbury, who I got to work on a couple of projects with, who was my hero growing up, I always loved his writing. He used to say, "I'm not trying to predict the future; I'm trying to prevent it." And so, a lot of that work is in the sort of the context of cautionary tales. But what made the original Star Trek so different is it was deliberately an optimistic view of the future. And there were a lot of things that were going on, in the 1960s that gave many people pause about the viability of the future of human civilization, not least of
Mhm.
which were the Vietnam War, the civil rights struggles, the vast inequality and poverty in a nation as rich as ours. How does any kid go hungry at night, let alone the larger world? And Gene Roddenberry, who created the original Star Trek and was himself quite the visionary, said, "You know what? This is uh, this is wrong. There needs to be a message out there that says that these problems are solvable. That it's not inevitable that we're going to face some kind of Roman Empire-esque decline." And so his conception of Star Trek was that let's look at the present from the point of view of a future where these problems are all basically behind us, and we have developed the technologies to literally explore the entire galaxy and learn whatever we can learn. And he also, at the time, this was, long before cable television, long before HBO and The Sopranos and all of these things that could never have been done on network TV, there were subjects that were still taboo on television. Interracial relationships, stories about God, and that explicitly questioned, religious assumptions and so forth. And Roddenberry was fascinated by those questions, and he wanted to address them. He tried to do that in some of his other shows, and it was a challenge. He was always fighting with the network censors. Well, if you do that in the context of science fiction, well, everybody thinks, well, this is just kind of weird and fantasy, and it's not the real world, and so they don't look at it as carefully. And you can get away with things, in a science fiction context that in a straight drama might raise a lot of eyebrows. And Star Trek did raise some eyebrows from time to time. Certainly, one of the first, if not the first, interracial kiss on television was between Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura in a third season episode. That episode uh, did not play in much of the American South. They did not
Mhm.
put it on the air because they didn't want
Wow.
to see a white man kissing a black woman, because they thought, well, we're gonna lose viewers. We're gonna get all these angry phone calls. That was the world of 1968, and so Roddenberry very very cleverly, managed to do things and hold up a mirror to society and question why things are the way they are. And from the perspective of, if we just keep moving forward, things are going to be so much better. It was a pretty simple kind of, I think, message ultimately. And I think that he really drew attention to the value of these kinds of utopian, for lack of a better word, visions of the future in contrast to the more dystopian fantasies. And I think that the dystopia, it's a reflection of the anxiety of the times, right? I mean, the 1950s were called the age of anxiety by a lot of people. And that anxiety was understandable because, we'd been through, a couple of traumatic world wars. We'd been successful, and certainly America in the late 1940s and early 1950s was extraordinarily prosperous by global standards and was coming into its own as a world power and so forth. But the specter of the atomic bomb and then the hydrogen bomb hung over a lot of this and cast a very long shadow. Still does, maybe not quite to the extent that it did back then. But, there was a lot of fear and anxiety. And I remember some of that. Again, I was very young at that time. But, I think we did at least one duck and cover drill when I was in grade school.
There's a lot of
Yes,
fear and anxiety today. And I feel like
absolutely.
that's something that, we have to actively combat against. How do you feel about, the way that the world is trending these days? I had an opportunity to speak with Rod Roddenberry, so Gene's son,
Yes.
right?
Uh-huh.
And he was super pessimistic, and it was such an interesting contrast. Like in one generation,
Yeah.
his dad was so hopeful, and he's like, I see a lot of negative stuff, but I do think that, humanity has it in us. But overall,
Mhm.
the message was a little pessimistic. How do you feel about everything these days?
It's definitely challenging to maintain that sort of you know Star Trek optimism these days. And one of the reasons that probably the main reason that Seth MacFarlane created the Orville is he was discouraged and sort of tired of seeing all the dystopian science fiction, especially in the new Star Treks. And the new Star Trek shows, I've watched some of them. I can't say that I've watched a lot of them. I worked on Star Trek for 12 years altogether. And I didn't think that there would be other Star Treks going forward or that I would be involved in anything remotely like Star Trek again after that period ended in the mid 2000s. And then when it came back, it's like, oh, wow, great. They're bringing back Star Trek. Hey, that's exciting. It's been years. And I enjoyed the first movie with Chris Pine and Zachary Quinto in that cast.
Hmm.
Um,
So
I didn't
hopeful, so
necessarily think it was
optimistic.
great.
I
Yeah,
I
but
mean, yeah, it
it
wasn't
was
like,
fun. It
it was
had
fun.
it had the spirit. I don't
Hmm.
know that it had the depth per se
Yeah.
of the original or next gen, but Seth really missed that episodic, optimistic, future oriented science fiction that says,
Hmm.
yes, we have it within us to to build the kind of future that is depicted on Star Trek, the original series, and the next gen, and to some extent the other shows. I mean, they're not completely dire by any means, but I think that what changed in the culture, again, with the advent of cable television and the opportunities to tell more gritty, dramatic stories without interference from censors, 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 not censors. I have a sensor on my phone. Um, at any rate, yeah, I think that opened the door to a lot of great creative writing that was because drama tends to go dark, right? It's
Hmm.
conflict and it's Sturm und Drang and it's murder and all of the other things. Well, with The Sopranos and Mad Men and Breaking Bad and all of these great shows that
Yeah.
started to crop up in the late '90s and early 2000s, Well, that was an opportunity for writers who really like to dig into that the darker forces of human life, and and that's most literature too,
Yeah.
because that's what kind of triggers the emotional reaction. Um,
Yeah, I hear you. I look at comic books, right? And comic
yeah,
books from that time were so much
yeah,
more optimistic and like, hey, we're gonna go
mm,
get them, you know? And
right,
now
right,
it's just so dark, right? It's like
yeah,
I guess my question to you is somebody that has created a lot of this pop culture. Do you
hmm
think it's a reflection of the anxieties like you were talking about that
hmm
are in the populace, and this is
yes.
what the artists are producing? Or do you think that on some level the pop culture is producing this and then it reflects in the populace? Because the writers and everybody are looking at world events and they're the anxious
Yes,
people that are spreading this
right.
culture. What do you feel
Oh,
like?
it is both, and there is definitely a feedback loop at play.
Hmm.
And feedback loops can be positive and negative. When Jimi Hendrix played his guitar and moved up to that to this peak and created feedback, it created some amazing sounds. It created a lot of horrible noise too, right? Um, so I think that yes, there is definitely a feedback mechanism. There are people who feel they're, for whatever reasons, and I think maybe creative people are a little more prone to anxiety than people who have more limited imaginations. I don't mean that in a negative sense, but people who think too much tend to be worriers, right? So you find that among a lot of writers. Um, and I do think that it does feed back into the culture. If you're fed a diet of nonstop, Sturm und Drang, as I mentioned earlier, it's gonna ultimately affect your outlook. And that's why I
Hmm.
think it's important to have shows like the Orville
Hmm.
out there saying, "Hey, no, 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 it doesn't really need to be that way. Why don't you include some positive um, imagery and storytelling in your media diet and counterbalance some of those negative reflections?" I think today, of course, we're seeing, and I'm not any kind of political commentator pundit. We've seen a lot of turmoil. Using that word not necessarily in the most emotional way, but um, politically, not just in the United States, but around the world, we've seen the ascension of a different model of government that is not the sort of idealized democracies that I grew up thinking were the best model for how to govern a society. Autocracies not only in Russia and China, but in Hungary and other places, and potentially here, because whatever you think of Trump, he is somebody who has autocratic impulses. He wants to be king. He may
What do
not
you
say that explicitly, but he does, and that's kind of astonishing to me that could happen. And I think that set aside how much change that will really uh, you know uh, foment here in the United States. Yeah, but the fact that he was elected at all is a huge change and has caused a lot of people anxiety. Causes a lot of people some kind of comfort, I guess. But and then the fact of climate change, the fact of AI. I think that you asked me earlier about sort of projecting out into the not too distant future. Well, this is a time of extraordinary change, and I don't think that AI is going to live up to some of the hype that you hear from people like Sam Altman or Elon Musk or others who believe that this is going to be civilization changing. But maybe it will be. I mean, it will certainly have an impact. It will certainly be a change. And I'm hoping it's going to be a change for the good, because I think there is a lot of incredibly valuable stuff that AI can do and is already proving that it can do. It has nothing to do with whether or not it's intelligent or conscious, which neither of those things are true at the moment, and I doubt that they ever will be. But in your own field in medicine, look at what AI can already do in terms of looking at protein structures and how proteins fold, which is an important part of how they react, how they behave in biological systems. The discovery of proteins that can act as antibodies. Well, that's a research project that's been going on for a very long time, and it's not easy to
Yeah.
do. And yet AI is now accelerating the pace at which we can make those discoveries.
Hmm.
In material science, that's already happening. Should AI, develop in the way that I hope, maybe in a few years we'll have room temperature superconductors that are easy to manufacture. That would have a huge impact on addressing the problem of global warming, among other
Let's
things.
let's double click on that.
Yeah.
There's obviously technological progress is happening exponentially right now,
Yes.
much different from when we were in the 60s or any other era of humanity. And there's a number of different technological breakthroughs that I think need to happen for us to get to that utopian society, right? Like there's
Yes.
this idea of a post-scarcity society of Star Trek is something that,
Hmm.
we have to do a lot to get there. What do you think that we need to do to get there? Like if that's the goal, where every human being has food, where every human being is able to live up to their full potential, you have
Hmm.
a physics background. What kind of technologies do we need, do you think, to get there?
Certainly, there's a book. I've met the author, and he contributed a piece to the Orville book that I wrote that came out in October. Emmanuel Saadia, he's an economics professor and historian. A few years ago, he wrote a book called Trekonomics, and he directly addressed the question of what is it. We have this utopian ideal, and he was focused primarily on Star Trek: The Next Generation as his model of, okay, they have this economy in the far future where there is no scarcity. There is no need to work to sustain your life. You don't have to work for food or shelter or medical care. That's irrelevant. You get that. It's automatic. How does that kind of a future work? And what is the currency of such a future? Well, the short answer to how we get there in Manu's mind is we have essentially unlimited energy that's clean energy, and we have replicator technology, which is a sort of a hyper advanced version of what we are doing now in 3D printing. So
Hmm.
on Star Trek: The Next Generation, Picard would go into his ready room, walk up to the replicator, and say, "Tea, Earl Grey, hot." The cup of tea would
Hmm.
appear, and it's like, well, that was as if by magic. Now that obviously in their conception of it involved transporters, which are a form of technology that I think are probably going to be in the indefinite future for hundreds, if not thousands, of years to come. But 3D printing and being able to create any kind of food you want with protein feedstocks or whatever else you might want to use. That kind of technology, I think, is within reach, and nuclear fusion probably will happen eventually. Clearly, it's taken much longer than the optimists would have guessed back in the 70s or 80s.
But we're getting closer, right? Like that's
We're
pretty
getting
clear.
closer. We're getting closer. It's incremental progress, which is always frustrating because you just want to see the big breakthrough, right?
Yeah.
But it'll happen. And I think, obviously we already have solar, which is cheaper than coal in the United States, I believe, at the moment, in terms of kilowatt price per kilowatt hour. We have geothermal, we have wind, we have other clever ways of harnessing energy that don't involve spewing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So I think technologically, one of the first things we have to do is make those kinds of technologies more widespread, decarbonize the economy, make sure that we are growing food in a changing climate that is nutritious and widely available. I
Hmm.
do think that beyond the technological dimensions of the problem, they're really social dimensions. It's really about finding fairer forms of government. Um,
Hmm.
I don't know if you've read Kim Stanley Robinson. He's a science fiction writer. And I've met him a few times at conferences and things over the years. Really nice guy, really good writer. He's a science fiction writer who has a PhD in English literature, so he's very literate. He wrote a book, his most recent book, called The Ministry for the Future. And the
Hmm.
premise of the book um, is that an international body, something like the UN, puts together a group whose sole purpose is to ensure the survival of of human civilization for decades and centuries to come. And so they are addressing problems like climate change, like scarcity, through whatever means can best, in their view, address those issues. And it's a great book. It's really good. It's really interesting, the various things that that Stan has to say about these issues. But a lot of it, I think, will come down to an active citizenry, and people recognizing that these problems will only get worse if we don't actively try to make them better.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, a show like the Orville plays a role in establishing a vision and making it clear that that vision does not come without some level of work. It's
Mm-hmm.
not just something that's automatically going to happen, right? We all have to be active participants in building that better future. And we can disagree about some of the means. There are a lot of different ways potentially to approach that. But, fundamental fairness, the golden rule, a society that is not based on a few winners and a lot of losers, which, unfortunately seems to be a trend these days, that hopefully will end sooner rather than later. And it isn't necessarily anything like a pure socialism or communism, whatever those words mean to different people. But it does mean establishing some fundamental level of fairness for everybody. And I think that, if AI does become the revolutionary technology that its, strongest advocates say it's going to be, then, yeah, we will probably need to look at something like universal basic income to make sure that people have shelter and food and proper medical care. There are a lot of things. Yeah.
What do you think about getting into space? Because I know that that's something that you have a background in.
Yeah.
There's obviously the public option, which is NASA, and then you have the private option, which is SpaceX. And there's lots of incremental steps that we need to get to become a spacefaring civilization.
Right.
What do you think that we need to do? Is it going to be the SpaceX Starship? Is it going to be NASA taking on more of a role? Is it going to be lunar colonies, Mars colonies?
Right.
What do you think that we're headed with that direction?
Well, the fundamental bottleneck is the cost of getting a pound of payload to low Earth orbit. This has always been the problem. It was not a problem in the 1960s per se, because of the imperative of getting a human being on the moon ahead of the Russians. That was John F. Kennedy's famous speech in 1961, when the Soviets kept achieving these firsts. First Earth orbiting satellite, first human in space, first multi-person crew, first woman in space, by the way, 1963, and first spacewalk. So they kept beating us, and that scared people. And of course, Kennedy said, look, we need to establish a goal and figure out a race, that we can win against the Soviets. And his study group came back 10 days later and said, look, landing a human being on the moon, bringing him home safely, the Russians would basically be starting from the same place as we are if we establish that as the goal. And so we won't have to catch up. It's kind of an even race. And so that's what we did. And money was not an object. Well, ever since then, obviously we won the race, and then people went on with their lives. It was no longer that interesting. And so the space shuttle was supposed to be the solution to the problem of cost, right? The space shuttle was supposed to bring down the cost of getting a pound of payload into low Earth orbit by a couple of orders of magnitude. In the late 1960s, early 1970s, a Saturn V launch cost something like $250 million. Now, in today's dollars, that's probably closer to like 4 or 5 billion. It's a lot of money to put 3 people on, in low Earth orbit and send 2 of them to the moon, which we can't do anymore, by the way. So the shuttle was supposed to bring down those costs. It failed in in that mission, unfortunately, for many, many reasons. But, one of the most salient and interesting statistics that I ever read about the space shuttle. Space shuttle had a payload capacity of about 60,000 pounds. If you could transmute lead into gold simply by virtue of putting it in the payload bay of the space shuttle, sending it into low Earth orbit and bringing it back down, it would not be economically sensible to do that.
Wow.
So that's how much it cost in the shuttle era to get stuff up to low Earth orbit. Every shuttle flight cost about $1.5 billion.
Dang.
That ain't cheap, right?
Mm-mm.
So Elon, say what you will about Elon, I think he's kind of gone off in some interesting directions. I would rather see him focus on cars and rockets than what he's doing right now. But his company, SpaceX, is very well run by a woman named Gwen Shotwell, and they have amazing engineers. And the Falcon 9 is a great vehicle, highly reliable. It has brought down the costs of getting a pound of payload into low Earth orbit significantly by a factor of 2 or 3 over earlier launch vehicles that were still in use, like the Delta II and the Atlas V and so forth. And he hopefully can repeat that feat with Starship. Now, Starship, who knows? I mean, I'm still waiting to see whether that is going to pan out the way that he hopes. And frankly, I don't see how Starship is going to land a human crew on the moon in the next 2 or 3 years. I don't think that's likely. I'm not an expert on the architecture of these kinds of missions and the technology involved in taking something like Starship and landing it, on the surface of the moon. It seems like overkill somehow to me, that's not really the way to do it. But I do think that, yes, they're expanding into space is going to be very important. I don't know that necessarily means establishing settlements on the moon or Mars. I know Elon is a vocal advocate of putting a human settlement on Mars and bringing the population by the middle of this century up to around 1 million people. I don't know that that's a good idea. I don't know it's a bad idea, but I can't say that that's really my particular vision for what our future in space might look like. I think it's going to be more oriented toward robotic technologies, potentially toward large space stations, like the famous sort of spinning donut ring in 2001, A Space Odyssey. Yeah, those are probably better environments for humans than the surfaces of the moon and Mars. And I think that, what we can do in terms of manufacturing in space, well, again, people have talked about that for decades. We've not yet found an application that would, be cost effective. But of course, that goes back to the bottleneck of how expensive it is to get anything up into low Earth orbit. Right out of the bat, right out of the box, you're spending, tens of thousands of dollars on a pound of payload. Now, I think, again, SpaceX has brought that down. I think it's maybe on the order of a couple of $1,000s. I'm not sure right now, but yeah, eventually maybe that'll happen. But of course, bringing anything from orbit back down to the Earth is, that's the easier thing, obviously, than getting it up there. But I can't imagine a future where thousands of payloads are coming back through the atmosphere every day from low Earth orbit or anywhere else, and not having an environmental impact that also has to be factored into the value of doing something like that. So I think off-Earth economies, they may take off on their own at some point when we have the technology to do that in a way that doesn't cost trillions upon trillions of dollars.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's a little, it's a little fuzzier to me, but I think once that bottleneck is broken, when it costs $100 a pound to get something into low Earth orbit and do it safely and routinely and so forth, then I think we'll start to be able to get a vision of what can be accomplished and how that can help us here on Earth going forward.
Yeah, I totally agree that That's the big bottleneck.
Hmm.
I wonder when it's going to happen. I hope that it happens in my lifetime. I'd love to
Yeah.
be able to see the classic, overview effect of the
Yeah.
Earth.
Right. Me too.
And I see progress happening, but it hasn't happened at a rate where it's accessible to people like us. So hopefully that would be something that would be changing. Listen, honestly, I feel like I could talk to you for another hour, but we have to get into our last three questions, which are
Sure.
general questions. But I do want to change it up a little bit because these were questions that I wanted to ask you, but I didn't have enough time to because we kind of went to these in these different directions. The first of which
Sure.
is aliens. You have a physics background. There's all these new disclosures happening. What are your
Hmm.
thoughts? Are we alone in the universe, or is this something that is all smoke and mirrors?
I doubt we're alone in the universe. I've followed some of the, some of the latest quote unquote revelations from people who have worked in the higher levels of government about these things, and their stories are compelling. But again, as somebody who was trained, as a scientist, I need to see the evidence. And as Carl Sagan used to say, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Um, the videos that we've seen from some of these Navy fighter jets of these TikTok shaped objects that seem to defy the laws of physics as we understand them. Fascinating. I need more than a video. I need more than an eyewitness account to conclude that something like that is not only real but alien technology from a civilization that is far more advanced than ours, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I would love it if that were true. I find that very exciting. Just more generally, based on what we know, well, when I was in college, we had not yet discovered a single exoplanet, single planet orbiting another star. We all assumed that they were out there, but there was no observational evidence. And I was willing to concede that, well, maybe our solar system is a freak occurrence, and maybe solar systems like ours are extraordinarily rare. Well, we've discovered that's not the case. That's encouraging in terms of, prospect for finding life. I don't know that it's entirely possible in my mind that there are all sorts of intelligent life forms in the universe, but that they're not technological. We have other intelligent life forms here on the earth, dolphins and whales and, squids for that matter, and different kinds of intelligence. I think that intelligence like ours is probably relatively rare. If it were common, I think we'd probably know about it by now. It's kind of a, shaky argument. And the other problem, of course, is just timescales. We've been able to send radio waves out into space for barely more than a century. How long are we going to keep doing that? Well, probably not much longer because we're already changing the technologies of how we communicate so that we're not leaking a lot of radio energy out into space because that's not efficient. This so-called window of contact, which people have talked about, if there were another civilization like ours, 1,000 light years away, just like us, maybe more advanced, maybe not quite as advanced, what are the odds that we would actually be able to find them and communicate at the time that we're at a roughly, in a certain kind of parity in terms of how we use the electromagnetic spectrum, right? I mean, there are billions of stars within 1,000 light years of the Earth, literally billions. The odds of finding the one that has some form of intelligent life that is also familiar with radio waves and has radio telescopes and the kinds of technologies that we use, or even more exotic things that we could potentially detect. What if that civilization existed and thrived 1 million years ago? That's a blink of an eye in the history of the universe, right?
Mm-hmm.
What are the odds that we would be at that sort of same parity with somebody relatively close by, and 1,000 light years is our backyard, right?
So do you think that that's
It's
the most
yeah,
compelling answer for you for the Fermi paradox, for why we haven't had any? It's
yeah,
just
pretty
the
much.
times don't match
Yeah,
up, because I
yeah,
get it. I mean, like in the grand scheme of things, the the amount of time that has existed in the history of the
yes,
universe, we are such a small insignificant speck on it, and for
right.
us to match up with those two, I get that. So
Yeah,
I
yeah.
guess if that's your most compelling argument,
Hmm.
I hear that, and I think that that's certainly something that is very grounded in science.
Right.
Last question about this: if you highlighted the tic tac, which is something that supposedly defies the laws of physics, right? This is,
Hmm.
or at least has technology that we don't understand
Right.
yet, right? That's, to me, one of the exercises that you must have been doing for a long time in your career. Is like you have this technical background, you have
Hmm.
this endpoint of something that you want to make believable, right? You want to make
Right.
something that has some sort of scientific background for this endpoint that does not exist yet. If you were to make that same kind of thought process, right? Like
Hmm.
how would you describe these things that are happening based on your scientific understanding of physics and everything like that? How is
Hmm.
it that these things are moving like that?
Yeah. Well, I would say that, yeah, my understanding is pretty limited. I want to admit that right up front. And the only thing that I've, you know, learned about to some degree anyway, not any kind of expertise, that would potentially fit that bill would be some kind of space warp effect. And of course, warp drive, is something that we invented, quote unquote, on Star Trek. Other people prior to Star Trek had considered that as a possible way of traveling ever since that Einstein developed the general theory of relativity, and showed us that we could conceptualize space as a kind of a fabric connected to time, and that the presence of matter and energy warps space, and warped space tells matter and energy how to move. So right there, if you had some technology that would allow you to warp space instantaneously in whatever fashion you would like to do that, that I think would probably be sufficient to explain the movements that we see in these videos.
Hmm.
But it could be something else because, again, we only know what we know. And I think that there is far more out there to be learned than we understand at our present state of technological and scientific development. It could be something so far removed from the way that we traditionally have thought about science for the last 400 and some years that it would take a huge conceptual shift in human understanding about the nature of the universe to really get a handle on how these things work if they are in fact real.
Very interesting. Yeah, I think that that's a lot what a lot of people say, but I
Yeah,
wanted to I like to learn by asking a lot of different people, and if a lot of smart people say the same thing, then that
yeah,
leads me to believe that maybe there's something to that, right? And so that's
right,
something that has been tossed around these circles, which is
sure,
very interesting to hear. I mean, if that's something that is
yeah,
possible, that would be a huge breakthrough for us as a spacefaring species.
yeah.
But
And
last
if
question.
for some reason these things have no mass, if there was a way to make them act like massless particles, then again, that would be, if they have no inertia, mass is a measure of inertia. You can somehow create an object, a physical object that has no inertia. Yeah, then I could imagine it maneuvering all sorts of crazy ways, right?
Yeah,
But
I
again,
can't
I have
wait
no
to.
idea how one would do that.
Yeah, I can't wait to see what comes out of the next few years of hearings.
Me
But
too.
that lends into my next question.
Yes.
If you could have a goalpost for humanity over the next 10 years, 20 years, what do you hope comes out of the future? What is something that you really look forward to? For me, like it's something very basic. Like I cannot wait till we have humanoid robots that can clean my dishwasher, that can fold my laundry. When I feel like we
Right.
have that, that's like the future for me, right?
Yeah.
But what does it look like for André Bormanis? What do you hope that comes out of the next 10, 20 years from technological breakthroughs, scientific breakthroughs, what have you?
Yeah, I would love to see um, a orders of magnitude reduction in the cost of getting payloads and people into space.
Mm-hmm.
Would love to have that experience myself. I would love to see supersonic travel come back. I'm with you. I'm with you on the robots.
Everybody is,
Personally,
right? Everybody
yeah.
is.
But my main thing, I am interested in and highly sympathetic to the people who are trying to expand human health span.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a believer in immortality in any practical sense. I think even if we could stop the aging process and retain our, the physiological processes we have in our mid-20s or wherever the sort of the optimum, state of the body might be, and do that indefinitely, well, something is going to get you eventually, right? You're going to, walk in front of a bus, or who knows what's going to happen. I'm not a fan of the idea of uploading our consciousness into computers. I don't think that that's plausible. I find that to be fantasy more than science fiction. But, if I could have, both of my parents lived into their early 90s. I hope I have that longevity kind of on my side, but of course you never know what might happen. But if I could, if I could have a long, healthy life, living into my, say, early 100s or to 110 or 120, without being decrepit mentally or physically, that would be wonderful, because I would love to see what the world looks like toward the end of this century.
Agreed.
And
Yeah,
I will be 100 years old in 2059 if I live that long.
Well, here's
Halley's
hoping to
Comet will
you.
be back. Yeah.
Yeah, here's hoping to
Yeah.
you seeing Haley's Comet again. Thank you so much for
Thank you so
speaking with
much.
us. Yeah, this is really
Oh, it's a
awesome.
pleasure. It's so
And
nice to meet you. Yeah.
yeah, nice to meet you too. And thank you to all of our listeners and our subscribers. If you don't mind, if you could please hit the like and subscribe button, that really helps us out. And if you want to follow André, he's got a new book coming out about the Orville, which is, I think, a really funny and hilarious take on utopian science fiction. So check that out. And for those of you guys who are listening on a regular basis, we will see you again in the future. Have a great day, everybody.
We appreciate you taking part in today's episode. Take this chance to reimagine a better future by joining a community of futurists who strive for a remarkable world. Be a part of this growing network and contribute to making the world a more positive place. Visit thefuturistsociety.net and subscribe to the show so you don't miss a drop of hopeful futurism.